What if the crown jewels hid more than just rubies? For centuries, England's kings ruled with scepters in hand and secrets in their hearts. Behind velvet curtains and battlefield glory, 30 royals lived lives history refused to name. This isn't about gossip, it's about the hidden truth stitched into the royal bloodline. From battlefield bromances to love letters laced with longing, these are the monarchs who reigned in daylight and loved in shadow. Welcome to the untold legacy of 30 secretly gay kings of England. Don't blink. The truth was always there, just wearing a crown. Before we dive headfirst into centuries of royal intrigue, take a second to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And hey, while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Let's light up the comments section with time zones and tea. King Edward. They found his body slumped in Berkeley Castle. Or at least, they say they did. A mysterious death. A throne lost. A whisper of rebellion. And somewhere under all the rubble of medieval politics, a love story. Edward II was never supposed to be a gay icon. He was a Plantagenet king with a temper, a taste for music, and a soft spot for stonemasons. The chroniclers called him weak, the barons called him foolish, but they all agreed on one thing: he loved Piers Gaveston way too much. Now, kings having favorites? Nothing new. But Edward didn't just promote Gaveston, he worshipped him, showered him in titles, let him interrupt meetings, gave him land, jewelry, possibly his heart. Parliament seethed, nobles rolled their eyes, and Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, gritted her teeth as the man she married kept sneaking off to his dearest friend. Gaveston wasn't subtle, either. He flaunted his status, wore purple robes only royalty could wear, and threw parties with insulting nicknames for the high lords of England. This wasn't just favoritism. It was personal. So they exiled him. More than once. But Edward always brought him back. When the nobles finally killed Gaveston in 1312, beheaded on a lonely hilltop, Edward was inconsolable. Some say he ordered mourning clothes. Some say he stopped eating. What's certain is this: he never got over it. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger. The rebound. More ruthless, more ambitious, and just as tight with the king. Edward loaded him up with power like he was trying to fill a void Gaveston had left behind. But Despenser didn't just alienate the nobles, she actively antagonized them. Land seizures, executions, torture. This wasn't politics anymore. It was personal vendetta, disguised as governance. The backlash was inevitable. Queen Isabella, now fed up with being sidelined, joined forces with her lover Roger Mortimer and launched a rebellion. They captured Edward, executed Despenser in the most brutal way imaginable, and forced the king to abdicate in favor of his teenage son. And then, silence. The official record says Edward died in captivity in 1327, but the story doesn't add up. Some letters hint at him escaping. Some chronicles claim he lived out his days in exile. What nobody debates, though, is that he died disgraced, betrayed, and alone. And yet, history never really forgot him. Over the centuries, Edward II's story has been retold through poetry, theater, and film, not as a tale of failure, but of forbidden love. His deep, obsessive devotion to two men, his refusal to hide it, his downfall driven not just by politics, but by passion. Was he gay? We don't know. Words like that didn't exist in his time. But what we do know is this: Edward II risked everything: his throne, his marriage, his life for the men he loved. He ruled badly. He loved boldly. And he left behind a mystery that still refuses to die. But if Edward II was the tragic romantic, the next king was something else entire. A man who made no apologies for his desires, cloaked them in courtly poetry, and ruled not just with power, but with charm. Let's meet the king who wrote love letters in code and kept the Duke of Buckingham a little too close. King James I? He was the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland, the man who survived the gunpowder plot, the king who commissioned the King James Bible. But behind the throne, behind the treaties and the scriptures, was a man who could not stop writing love letters. King James I wasn't shy. He was awkward. He walked with a limp, spoke with a thick Scottish brogue, and drooled when he talked. But if his body stumbled, his pen danced. The man was a literary romantic, and he directed the full force of that affection toward a select few male courtiers, chief among them Robert Carr and George Villiers. Let's start with Robert Carr. He was young, dashing, and conveniently fell off a horse right in front of the king. James rushed to help him, healed his wounds, and then made him a viscount. Coincidence? Not likely. Carr became James's favorite overnight, elevated to the Earl of Somerset, showered with gifts, brought into every inner circle. The letters between them, though written in the flowery style of the daydrip with affection, James called him my sweet child and my darling. He signed letters, your own dad and husband, blurring every line between paternal warmth and romantic obsession. But Carr's story didn't end well. He got tangled in scandal accused of murder, and the death of Sir Thomas Overbury and fell from grace. James tried to protect him, but the tide turned. Carr was imprisoned. The love faded. Enter George Villiers. Even younger, even more charming, and, it seems, even more adored. James was already an older king when he met him, but it was love at second sight. He called George Steenie, a nickname born from a remark that his face looked like a saint's. James made him Duke of Buckingham, gave him lands, titles, money, influence beyond reason, and once again wrote letters full of passion. To you only, James wrote to Villiers, I make my vows. He compared his love to the biblical bond between David and Jonathan, said he wished he could lie upon your naked breast. And yes, these were private letters never intended for history's gaze, which makes them all the more revealing. No, this isn't just court gossip. This is a pattern. A king who repeatedly elevated handsome young men to positions of extraordinary power, who filled pages with yearning, who seemed to trust them not just with the affairs of state, but with the affairs of his heart. Was it romantic? Was it physical? The historians argue. Some say the language was normal for the time intimate, yes, but not necessarily sexual. Others point out that James's own contemporaries whispered about the nature of these relationships. French ambassadors rolled their eyes. English nobles quietly mocked the king's open adoration. But James didn't care. He ruled as he pleased, loved as he pleased. And if the world thought it odd, he didn't flinch. Even on his deathbed, with his kingdom hanging in the balance, he clutched the hand of George Villiers, his favorite to the very end. James's reign was a balancing act between his Scottish roots and his English crown, between Protestant politics and Catholic threats, between kingly dignity and deeply personal devotion. But through it all, he wrote, and he loved, and he left behind a paper trail that modern historians still can't quite decipher. Were these just poetic flourishes, or coded confessions? Either way, James's story is not just about what he did, it's about who he couldn't live without. And while James let his emotions spill in ink, our next monarch was a man of the sword, a crusader, a legend, a king whose battlefield courage earned him the name Lionheart. but whose private life raised questions that history still hesitates to answer. 2 kings in, and the secrets are already thicker than a Tudor tapestry. If you're into stories that history class skipped, make sure to subscribe. This rabbit hole goes deep. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I want to know who's unpacking royal drama over breakfast and who's in too deep at 3 a.m. King Richard the First, the Lionheart. The crown didn't define Richard. The battlefield did. He was the warrior king, the icon, the golden-haired crusader who marched across continents with a sword in one hand and a cross on his chest. Songs were sung about him. Enemies feared him. Even Saladin, his legendary rival, respected him. And yet, when you scrape away the glory and peel back the armor, something quieter lingers in the shadows, the question of who Richard truly loved. Richard the Lionheart wasn't supposed to be a domestic monarch. He spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. The rest of the time, he was fighting in the Holy Land, sieging castles, brokering truces, and according to some chroniclers sharing a bed with the King of France. That's right, King Philip II. The sources are careful, as they always are when it comes to royalty and suggestion, but the details are too peculiar to ignore. One chronicle from the period openly states that Richard and Philip ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night they slept in the same bed. That alone, in medieval context, isn't necessarily proof of a romantic relationship. Sharing beds was common, especially among nobles, for warmth or diplomacy, but it's the tone intimate, emphasized, and repeated that turns heads. Richard and Philip weren't just co-monarchs on a mission, they were inseparable, political allies, strategists, confidants, and, perhaps, more. But Richard's life wasn't a love story, it was a war story. He spent years fighting for control of Jerusalem during the Third Crusade. He built fortresses, led cavalry charges, and made peace deals in the middle of scorched deserts. His reputation was forged in iron and blood, not in candlelight and poetry. Still, his private life remained conspicuously empty. Richard married Berengaria of Navarre, but there's no record of the two ever producing children or even spending much time together. In fact, she never even set foot in England during his reign. While Richard was storming Acre and besieging castles in France, Berengaria waited in quiet obscurity. Their marriage, like many royal unions, served diplomacy, not desire. And then there are the confessions. After returning from the Crusades and being imprisoned in Germany, Richard, according to one account, confessed sins of the flesh to the Pope. The language is vague, intentionally so. But in the medieval church, that phrase carried heavy implication. Was it adultery? Homosexual acts? Both? We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that Richard's body was divided after death, his heart buried in Rouen, his entrails in Chalice, and his bones in Fontevraud Abbey beside his parents. A fragmented legacy for a fragmented Monone who lived between battlefields and rumors, between the myth of the Lionheart and the man beneath the crown. The church loved him for his piety. The bards praised him for his bravery. But history, ever careful, never quite solved the mystery of his heart. Was Richard gay? It's a modern question imposed on a medieval mind. His time didn't have the language or the permission for such things. But there's something telling in the way historians still circle his relationships, unable to dismiss the warmth between him and Philip, or the conspicuous absence of heirs from a king who was never without company. So we're left with speculation, with letters, with chronicles, with whispers from the past. Richard died, predictably, in battle, shot with a crossbow bolt while laying siege to a rebellious vassal. He didn't go out with a scandal. He didn't leave behind romantic letters. But he left behind something Elsian image, carved into the national myth, with a secret folded deep inside it. And if Richard was the lion on the battlefield, our next king was the fox in the palace. Quiet, calculated. He ruled not with blood and steel, but with influence. And somewhere behind the marble walls of court, a different kind of favoritism was beginning to stir. King William III of Orange. He wasn't supposed to be England's king, not really. William of Orange was a Dutch prince, the product of European Protestant politics, and a reluctant ruler who only took the throne after a revolution that didn't even cost a drop of royal blood. They called it the Glorious Revolution. Clean, clinical, constitutional. But William? He was something else entirely distant, melancholy, and fiercely private. He ruled beside his wife Mary II, who was also his cousin, and awkwardly the daughter of the king he helped overthrow. Theirs was a union of shared religion and shaky loyalties. They presented a united Protestant front against Catholic James II, but in private they were distant, childless, not loveless perhaps, but certainly not the kind of story that inspires sonnets. The real emotional anchor in William's life came not from Mary, but from a young Dutch courtier named Arnold Joost van Keppel. Arnold wasn't just a friend, he was a favorite, and in William's court, that meant something specific. The young man rose through the ranks with alarming speed. He was given titles, money, land, and command positions that infuriated English nobles who had spent years waiting for royal recognition. Van Keppel went from obscurity to the earldom of Albemarle, all under William's very watchful, very affectionate eye. Now, in the cold political world of 17th century Europe, favoritism wasn't exactly a crime. Monarchs always had close confidants. But William's attachment to Van Keppel raised eyebrows because it wasn't just political, it was personal. They traveled together, slept in adjacent quarters. Van Keppel accompanied William on military campaigns, not just as a general, but as a constant presence. And after Mary's death, when the king was emotionally shattered, it was Van Keppel who became his primary companion. But it's the way William defended him that really sings. The English Parliament grumbled, nobles complained, pamphlets circulated, mocking the closeness between the king and his handsome young favorite. The whispers weren't subtle. William's answer? He gave Van Keppel more land, more titles, more trust. The more they questioned it, the tighter William clung to him. It's easy to read too much into these historical arrangements, and just as easy to ignore what's sitting plainly on the page, a king with no heirs whose affection for one man eclipsed all others. A man who had been emotionally aloof his whole life raised without a father, orphaned young, trained for power but never for intimacy, and who seemed to finally find something like it in Arnold's presence. After William's death from a riding accident thrown from a horse because of a molehill, of all things Van Keppel was left a wealthy and titled man. He grieved quietly, retreated from politics, and faded from the stage. No scandal, no memoirs. Just a life touched by proximity to something powerful and unspoken. And that's the word that hovers around William III, unspoken. His reign shaped modern Britain. He cemented parliamentary monarchy, strengthened Protestantism, tied England to continental politics. But behind the laws and wars was a man who never explained himself, who kept his love letters private, who gave everything, land, wealth, trust, to a man history still doesn't quite know what to do with. Was William gay? Maybe. Was he in love? Almost certainly. But history isn't always about knowing. Sometimes it's about listening between the lines. And the next king on our list? Well, he didn't listen to anyone. Not his nobles, not his church, not even his queen. Because when King Edward VIII fell in love, he risked the crown. But before Wallace Simpson, before the scandal, there was another story, a quieter one, wrapped in tuxedos, whispered in drawing rooms, and buried under royal silence. King Edward VIII. If you know anything about Edward VIII, you know this. He gave up the crown for love. It's one of the most famous royal scandals in modern history. A king who reigned for less than a year abdicated the throne and triggered a constitutional crisis all because he wanted to marry Wallace Simpson, an American divorcee with a complicated past and a less than enthusiastic reception from the British establishment. But that's only the surface, because before Wallace, before the headlines, the radio broadcasts, the exile, the title of Duke of Windsor there, were other stories, stories not printed in official biographies, stories whispered behind palace doors, stories about the prince's early years, his friendships, his preferences, his secrets. Edward was a product of two worlds raised in the strict, suffocating formality of the British royal household, and yet yearning for something looser, freer. His youth was defined by rebellion. Against protocol, against his father, against anything that smelled of duty. He drank, he partied, he chased romance, but not always in the direction history expected. Before his obsession with Wallace, Edward formed intense, emotionally charged bonds with a series of men. The most frequently named is Lord Louis Mountbatten, later famous as the mentor to Prince Charles and the last Viceroy of India. But in his younger years, Mountbatten was something else, handsome, well-connected, and very, very close to the Prince of Wales. Letters between the two are lost, scrubbed, buried in archives, but their connection was more than casual. They vacationed together, dined together, shared private evenings away from court. Rumors circulated within aristocratic circles, nothing explicit, never public, but persistent. There were others too, actors, artists, soldiers. Edward kept a wide circle of male companions, many of whom he remained attached to for years. His father, King George V, was not amused. He found his son weak, effeminate, irresponsible. And maybe, in a way, Edward was. He wasn't built for kingship. He was emotionally fragile, restless, and deeply insecure. But underneath the playboy image was something more personal, a young man trying to find connection in a life built entirely on public image. What makes Edward's story especially complicated is the way he performed heterosexual masculinity so loudly. He flaunted relationships with woman dancers, aristocrats, debutantes. He had affairs with married women, single women, women from both sides of the Atlantic. Some of it was genuine, but some of it felt like overcorrection. The Wallace-Simpson relationship? It was real. There's no question he loved her. But even that love had a strange dynamic. Wallace reportedly referred to him as her little man, and their relationship, according to some royal insiders, had more to do with domination and control than passion. She protected him, handled him, managed his moods. Some wondered whether the emotional codependency masked other unmet desires. And here's the twist. Even after giving up the throne and becoming the Duke of Windsor, Edward never stopped surrounding himself with men advisors, secretaries, confidants. His household remained almost entirely male. His comfort zone was never the family dinner table. It was the salon, the yacht, the private club. But history, of course, wrote him as the straight, tragic romantic, the man who gave up everything for a woman, the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate love story. Yet beneath that story is another one, a quieter tale of suppressed identity, of performance, of a royal who may have spent his entire life hiding behind the one decision that made him famous. Because sometimes the loudest love story is the one meant to drown out all the others. And if Edward VIII was the man who walked away from power in the name of love, the next king never had to give up anything because he never really showed his cards at all. King Richard II kept his crown, his secrets, and his favorites all to himself. But the way he clung to one man in particular, that raised more than just eyebrows. It raised the question, how close is too close when you're sitting on a throne, King Richard II? He was born into chaos, and he left behind something even messier. A kingdom on the edge of civil war and a legacy permanently warped by rumor, rebellion, and a love that may have rewritten the rules of royal loyalty. King Richard II came to the throne at just 10 years old, too young to rule, too old to ignore. He grew up in a world of adult ambition, surrounded by nobles who smiled with one hand on the sword hilt. As a boy king, Richard learned two things quickly: that power can vanish overnight, and that survival depends on who you trust. Enter Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, childhood companion, fast favorite, and, depending on who you ask, the love of Richard's life. The connection between Richard and de Vere wasn't subtle. As the king matured into his teens and early 20s, he began elevating de Vere in ways that stunned the court. Titles poured in: Earl of Oxford, then Marquis of Dublin, and eventually Duke of Ireland, a title entirely invented just to show how far Richard was willing to go. The court was scandalized. Dukedoms were rare. Creating one for a favorite, especially someone not from the most powerful noble families, was seen as reckless at bestand, to the paranoid elite dangerous. This wasn't just favoritism. It was infatuation with consequences. De Vere became a constant presence in the king's inner circle. He dined with him, advised him, traveled with him, and reportedly even shared chambers on royal progress. Ambassadors from other courts raised eyebrows. Chroniclers noted the unnatural affection between the two men. The king's own relatives worried that de Vere was manipulating him, or worse, had ensnared his heart entirely. And then came the backlash. By the mid-1380s, Richard was at war not with foreign armies, but with his own nobles. A faction known as the Lords Appellant rose up, furious over de Vere's power and Richard's refusal to bend. Accusations flew. De Vere was corrupt, arrogant, dangerous. The nobility wanted him gone. Richard refused. He protected de Vere like a lion shields a cub, even as Parliament turned hostile. But politics has no patience for sentiment. In 1387, the Lords Appellant raised troops and defeated de Vere's forces in battle. Richard had to watch as his closest companion fled England, stripped of lands, titles, and dignity. And even in exile, Richard didn't forget him. He kept de Vere's titles intact in his mind, sent him money, and plotted a return. When de Vere died abroad in a suspicious hunting accident in 1392, Richard was reportedly inconsolable. This wasn't a minor court reshuffle. This was the king's emotional core being torn from him, and he never really recovered. His rule after de Vere's fall was marked by paranoia, vindictiveness, and a slow-burning fury that eventually led to his downfall. And here's the thing. Richard wasn't stupid. He was well-read, artistically inclined, and deeply aware of his image. He didn't make de Vere a duke by accident. He didn't parade his affection publicly without understanding the risk. He chose to let people see, and he didn't care what they thought. The line between politics and romance was blurry in the 14th century. Public displays of closeness between men weren't always viewed through a sexual lens. But the backlash to Richard and de Vere suggests this wasn't just about policy. It was about perception. Richard made De Vere the center of his emotional and political world, and when that bond was severed, everything else began to unravel. He was eventually deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry Vond, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. Richard died in captivity, likely starved to death, his reign erased, his affections dismissed as delusion or deviance by his enemies. But history, ever the revisionist, has looked back at Richard not just as a failed king, but as a man who loved boldly in a time when such love could ruin you. His devotion to De Vere was so intense, so unrelenting, that it may have cost him everything. And if Richard's love led to his fall, our next king made sure that never happened because he hid in plain sight with a palace full of mistresses and a court full of whispers. King Charles II was every inch the ladies' man, or so the legend goes. But behind the velvet and the vices, something else flickered, something no one dared say out loud. King Charles II, he came back from exile with swagger in his step and mischief in his eyes. England had just executed his father, outlawed monarchy, and spent over a decade under Puritan rule. Then suddenly, the Restoration hit like a thunderclap. The theaters reopened. The wigs got taller. The morals got looser. And at the heart of it all stood Charles III, ultimate comeback king, dripping in charm, defiance, and silk. His reputation? Legendary. A connoisseur of excess. A serial seducer. The merry monarch who fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, but never a legitimate heir. His reign was painted in shades of scandal and sensuality, an open rebellion against the cold grey austerity of Cromwell's England. But amid the bedchambers of mistresses like Barbara Palmer and Nell Gwynn, a quieter pattern began to emerge, a string of close, intense, and sometimes deeply peculiar relationships with men. And among them, one name stood out like a cheeky wink in a crowded ballroom: John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester. Rochester was everything the Restoration adored, and forayed a poet, a libertine, a rake with the tongue of a devil and the charm of a fallen angel. He wrote verses too filthy to print, insulted courtiers to their faces, and once disguised himself as a quack doctor just to mock high society. He was openly bisexual, a scandal on two legs. And Charles didn't just tolerate him, he adored him. Their relationship blurred the line between patronage and affection. Rochester was in and out of favor like a yo-yo, exiled for his provocations and then welcomed back with a grin. When he insulted the king in A Poema King, his performance in bed and on the throne, Charles still allowed him back to court. Why? Because Rochester made him laugh. Because he stirred something that the dozens of painted mistresses never quite touched. But it wasn't just Rochester. Charles's inner circle was stacked with men who, while not publicly labeled as lovers, formed a pattern of deep, emotional attachment. His male favorites shared his private moments, his hunting trips, his late-night confidences. He promoted them generously, defended them fiercely. For a man so publicly defined by his heterosexual appetites, Charles surrounded himself with a surprising number of glittering, eccentric male courtiers whose presence raised more than a few powdered eyebrows. Was it all just camaraderie? Was Charles simply embracing the flamboyant vibe of the Restoration Court? Possibly. But it's also possible that the king ever, the performer, was playing a role crafted for him by history, hiding quieter truths beneath his laughing exterior. The contradictions are striking. Here was a king whose public life was a carnival of lust, yet whose private letters remain largely unrevealing, who publicly flaunted his affairs with women but left just enough ambiguity in his male relationships to spark centuries of speculation. Was it performance? Diversion? Or was it simply complexity, the messy, real kind that doesn't fit into neat boxes? Even his own court couldn't decide. Some saw him as a libertine with no filter, others as a cynic who used sex as a political tool. But beneath the powdered wigs and candlelit chaos, Charles remained, above all, a man who seemed most himself when surrounded by people who didn't demand he be kingly. He was a master of duality, publicly indulgent, privately guarded, laughing in public, brooding in private, married to diplomacy, betrothed to impulse. And somewhere in that swirl of contradiction lies the faint outline of a man who might have hidden something tender behind all the theatrical flair. So yes, Charles II may have gone down in history as England's greatest womanizer, but history has a habit of hiding its best stories behind the curtain, and the next king, well, he didn't have to perform, because no one questioned his virility. 6 wives, towering temper, legendary appetite. But even Henry VIII had a past he didn't advertise that just might have started in the arms of a best friend with a sword and a smile. 7 kings down, and we've barely scratched the surface, turns out. Royal closets had more skeletons than suits of armor. If this is your kind of deep dive, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's still hiding in the throne room. And seriously, I'm curious, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Middle of the day or dead of night? Let me know who's riding this royal roller coaster with me. King Henry VIII. He's the king most school children remember, the one who broke from the Pope, founded the Church of England, and married 6 women in a doomed royal roulette. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's how the rhyme goes. Henry VIII wasn't just a monarchy, was a myth in motion, towering, tempestuous, larger than life. He was a lover, a tyrant, a poet, a glutton, and a terrifying political force. But there's another chapter no one put into the rhyme, a quieter, shadowy footnote buried beneath all the wives and wars. A story about a young prince, a noble companion, and a bond that may have run far deeper than politics or friendship allowed. Before the wives, before Anne Boleyn's dark eyes lit a national crisis, there was Charles Brandon. Brandon was everything young Henry admired, a champion jouster, a fellow knight, daring, dashing, utterly magnetic. The two met as boys, growing up in the same glittering court where politics masqueraded as pageantry. Henry's father, the calculating Henry VII, had built a new dynasty from the rubble of the Wars of the Roses. Young Henry, the second son who became heir after his brother Arthur died, was raised with the weight of survival on his back, and Charles Brandon became his anchor. The bond was immediate, intense, and inescapable. Letters between them are scarce. Henry wasn't one for heart-spilling correspondence, but their actions said more than parchment ever could. Henry showered Brandon with titles. He made him Duke of Suffolk, a staggering leap from Brandon's modest, noble beginnings. He turned him into one of the most powerful men in England, despite opposition from his council. And when Brandon secretly married Henry's sister Mary, without permission, the king's reaction was oddly muted. Any other noble would have faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. But not Brandon. Henry forgave him. Quickly. Almost suspiciously quickly. This wasn't just royal favoritism. This was protection. This was indulgence. This was the kind of loyalty that comes not from politics, but from a bond forged in the molten heat of emotional reliance. Now, Henry went on to marry repeatedly. He pursued women with terrifying determination, but some historians have noted a curious shift. His most obsessive relationships with women, Anne Boleyn in particular, seemed to emerge after Brandon's influence began to wane. As Henry's emotional anchor moved away, his behavior with women became more volatile, more consuming. Was he trying to fill a void? Was the rage and paranoia that came later in life in part born from an unspoken grief? We'll never know for sure. The Tudor court was a masterclass in censorship. If there were letters, if there were confessions, they are long gone. But the clues linger. In Brandon's constant promotions, in Henry's unusual leniency, in the way Brandon remained close even when others fell. It's worth remembering that in the early 1500s, England didn't yet have the language or the tolerance for any deviation from rigid heteronormativity. Any emotional intimacy between men had to be disguised as loyalty, brotherhood, camaraderie. But even then, there were limits, and Henry pushed the mat, least with Brandon. Later in life, Henry grew bitter, obsessive, paranoid. His legs ulcerated, his court thinned. He turned against former friends with terrifying ease, but Brandon stayed in favor until his death. He outlived 4 of Henry's wives, outlasted Cromwell, dodged the executioner's axe that so many others kissed. He was, in a way, untouchable, not because of politics, but because Henry couldn't bear to lose him. Was Henry VIII gay? Probably not in the way we define it today. But was there a love in his life that didn't make it into the portraits or propaganda? A connection so powerful it bent the rules of royal judgment? Absolutely. And while Henry hid any softer emotions beneath layers of armor, beheadings, and theological declarations, the next king didn't need to hide much because no one was paying attention. King George VI was the quiet one, the reluctant one, the wartime rock. But beneath the silence of the stammering sovereign may have lived a tenderness no one was supposed to notice. King George VI. He never wanted to be king. George VI was the royal born into the shadows, a second son, a naval officer, a shy figure quietly navigating the background while his older brother Edward VIII soaked up the spotlight in the scandals. But history had other plans. When Edward abdicated in 1936, George was thrust onto the throne, unprepared, unwilling, and deeply burdened. The world would come to know him as the steady hand during Britain's darkest hours, the monarch with the stammer, the symbol of courage in a time of war. But beneath the medals and the speeches lay a quieter truth. George VI was a man who spent his life avoiding attention, and not just because of the throne. His legacy is built on modesty, restraint, and loyalty. Yet even in that modesty, the patterns of his affections tell their own quiet story. George married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, later the beloved Queen Mother. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, and by all accounts, the marriage was warm, supportive, and real. But royal marriages, especially in the early 20th century, were expected to be many things. Loving, sometimes. Functional, always. Honest about everything? Not necessarily. Throughout his life, George VI formed intense, enduring bonds with a handful of men, particularly during his naval career. These weren't just casual friendships or political alliances. They were emotional lifelines. His closest relationships often came from the ranks of his personal staff, bodyguards, equerries, and naval companions. They shared daily routines, private retreats, and long hours away from the public eye. Among these companions, a few stood out. Names not etched in monuments, but tucked into court records and memoirsmen who remained at his side not just for protocol, but for comfort. George was known to prefer male company in informal settings. He felt safest with those who knew how to be silent, how to understand his awkward silences, how to protect his vulnerability without making it obvious. He never made speeches about personal emotion. He never wrote the kind of letters that historians could brand with scandal. He left no trail of romantic confession, no hidden journal, no political suicide notes wrapped in perfume and panic. But he also left behind an air of emotional austerity that didn't quite add up because the people who knew him best described him not as cold, but as deeply sensitive. He stammered not from ignorance, but from anxiety. He smoked heavily, possibly from the pressure of containment. And when the Second World War erupted and the Blitz bombarded London, he refused to leave Buckingham Palace, saying that if his people were being bombed, he would be too. That wasn't just duty. That was a man looking for authenticity, trying to feel something real in a life that constantly told him to suppress. In modern terms, we'd say he was emotionally repressed, but in royal terms, he was the model of discretion. And that discretion, the careful shielding of his inner world, has only deepened the mystery around his personal life. The rumors about George VI's orientation have always been quiet. Not because there's no substance, but because there's no evidence. No smoking gun, no scandalous photographs, just patterns. Relationships that seem to mean more than they should have. A man who lit up in private company and shut down in public. A sovereign who never quite looked at ease unless he was surrounded by his mail, staff relaxed, almost playful, in a way the public never saw. And maybe that's the real story, not of scandal or subversion, but of subtlety. George VI didn't rebel like Edward. He didn't parade like Charles II or rule with violent passion like Henry. He simply endured, quietly, carefully, and perhaps with a private life full of affection that no one dared to name. But if George was the master of quiet loyalty, our next king thrived in the company of knights and causacious reign boiling with emotion, secrecy, and scandal. King Stephen ruled in chaos, and amidst the civil war and blood-soaked loyalties, he held a circle of men so close it left historians wondering just what kind of bonds they really were. King Stephen. He was never meant to wear the crown, but then again, very little about King Stephen's reign followed the script. The early 12th century was not a peaceful time in England. After the death of King Henry, or I who had named his daughter Matilda as his heir, the succession was supposed to be simple. Matilda would rule, the nobles would swear fealty, and England would finally step into a modern era under the command of a woman. Instead, Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, raced across the Channel, grabbed the royal treasury, and declared himself king. Coup successful, crisis ignited. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war, the anarchy, as it came to be known, a brutal, bloody, confused era where barons changed sides like cloaks, fortresses burned, and ordinary people suffered quietly in between. Stephen ruled in this chaos, not as a visionary, not even particularly as a tyrant, but as something stranger. A king whose closest bonds were not with his wife, not with his royal court, but with a small, fiercely loyal circle of men. At the center of this circle were Stephen's knights, particularly a few whose names appear repeatedly in chronicles, not just as commanders but as personal companions, chief among them, William of Ypres. William was a Flemish mercenary, a career soldier, and Stephen's right hand through every siege, retreat, and fragile peace. But he wasn't just an asset on the battlefield. He was a constant in Stephen's personal world, staying by his side for years in ways that stretched far beyond strategy. When Stephen was captured, William fought like a man possessed to secure his release. When others doubted, William stood firm. When Stephen was at his most politically vulnerable, William remained steady, unwavering, unreasonably devoted. And Stephen returned that loyalty with something that, to many contemporaries, seemed suspiciously extravagant. He gave William land, titles, authority far beyond what a foreign mercenary typically earned. He granted him command over major territories, He allowed him access to court decisions usually reserved for barons of noble birth. These weren't just gestures of gratitude. They were acts of trust, emotional, intimate, deeply personal trust. The chroniclers didn't miss it. Several 12th century sources note the unusually close bond between the two men. One even referred to William as more beloved to Stephen than any of his barons. Another made veiled references to the affection that surpassed brotherhood, in an era where language was coded, subtle, and easily deniable. Those are not casual observations. Stephen was married to Matilda of Boulogne, not to be confused with his rival Empress Matilda, and, by all accounts, their marriage was politically functional and personally cordial. Matilda supported him fiercely, even leading troops during his imprisonment. But the emotional heart of Stephen's daily life always seemed to beat beside his men, with William. With a handful of favored companions who dined with him, prayed with him, and most tellingly, remained his constants while his court turned to dust. It's important to recognize that medieval masculinity allowed for more overt affection between men than modern minds are used to. Knights pledged loyalty on bended knee. They kissed in ceremonies. They shared beds during travel. But even within those customs, Stephen's preferences stood out. He was not a romantic monarch. He left behind no poetry, no declarations, no scandals involving courtiers or lovers. But in his unwavering emotional investment in a few chosen men, especially William of Ypres, showed us something quietly extraordinary. A king ruling through chaos, holding tightly to the one connection that never betrayed him. When Stephen died in 1154, the crown passed peacefully to Henry II, ending the anarchy and restoring order. William disappeared into history's footnotes, a foreign knight too close to power, too enigmatic for legend. And yet, in the ruins of Stephen's stormy reign, a whisper remains, not of battles lost or thrones contested, but of loyalty that looked suspiciously like love. If Stephen's affections were forged in war, our next king's reputation was built on infamy. Because King John the Villain of Robin Hood tales and Magna Carta fame wasn't just cruel to his barons. The rumors about his personal life included accusations that shocked even the medieval court. Some were slander, but some stuck. King John. His name echoes with infamy. The tyrant king. The oath breaker. The royal villain of the Robin Hood tales. King John of England has long stood as the poster child for medieval monarchy, gone wrong, greedy, paranoid, cruel, and catastrophically inept. He lost Normandy to the French, extorted his nobles into rebellion, and was ultimately forced to sign the Magna Carta, the document that planted the seed of constitutional government. But beneath the broken alliances and battlefield failures lurks a lesser-known side of King John's story, one layered with rumors, hushed allegations, and peculiar patterns that suggest his crimes may not have ended with taxes and tyranny. To understand John, you have to understand power and his obsession with it. Unlike his brother Richard the Lionheart, who earned respect on the battlefield, John was not a warrior. He was a schemer. A whisperer, a master of manipulation who ruled with bribes, spies, and coercion. Where Richard inspired loyalty, John bought it, and sometimes he bought more than just allegiance. Among the numerous accusations leveled against John by his enemies, one stands out not for its clarity, but for its peculiar persistence: the charge of unnatural lusts. These weren't euphemisms for heterosexual debauchery. John had plenty of that, an impressive string of mistresses, and a reputation for seducing noble women and servant girls alike. But these accusations, often embedded in formal complaints by barons and clerics, seemed to point elsewhere. Specifically, they targeted John's treatment of his male attendants. Several baronial documents and church condemnations reference the king's immoral practices with his household knights and pages. Some barons even use the phrase, "in the manner of Sodom," a medieval code for male-on-male relations. Now, it's crucial to understand the politics here. Accusations of sodomy were often weaponized against kings as slander, but they weren't used casually, and in John's case, they were used repeatedly. There was something about the closeness he kept with certain male courtiers that made even his enemies uncomfortable. Some of these attendants were granted lavish gifts, sudden titles, and appointments to key positions far beyond their merit. Sound familiar? It's a pattern that stretches across centuries of monarchs, but in John's case, it came with a thick fog of menace. Where other kings protected their favorites, John controlled his. He kept them isolated, dependent. He was known to manipulate affections, pit servants against each other, and punish those who grew too independent. His court wasn't a place of open camaraderie. It was a fortress of fear, and his closest male companions walked a narrow line between intimacy and servitude. Historians are divided. Some argue these allegations were nothing more than political propaganda designed to paint John as morally corrupt to justify rebellion. But others suggest there's more to it. The consistency of the claims. The fact that they persisted in both noble complaints and clerical records. The specific phrasing used always careful, always coded. It's not proof, but it's not nothing. And John, unlike most kings on this list, never tried to counter the narrative. He simply let it fester. He was too busy quelling rebellions, plotting excommunications, and trying not to drown in the consequences of his own paranoia. When he died in 1216, rumored to be poisoned, though likely from dysentery, his court was in shambles. His barons had forced a peace treaty on him. His territories in France were lost. His crown had slipped, and his legacy was scorched. But among the many tales of his misdeeds, the quiet, persistent suggestion of same-sex liaisons remains neither confirmed nor dismissed, a ghost in the margins. A reflection of how even kings, even tyrants, leave traces of their private selves in the records of those who feared them most. And if John ruled through fear, the next king ruled under a shadow his own father's legacy, and perhaps his own secrets. Because when Charles I took the throne, he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited whispers about court favorites, about passionate friendships, and about the echo of desire that had once shaped his father's rule, King Charles I. His reign ended in a whisper and a thud, the soft words of a prayer and the sharp fall of an axe. King Charles I was the only English monarch to be tried and executed by his own people, a man of stubborn principles, divine right obsession, and painfully poor timing. But long before he lost his head on a frosty January morning, Charles lived in the long shadow of a king who wore his affections like medals. His father, James I, where James had doted on his male favorites with fawning letters and public favor, Charles was quieter, colder, harder to read, but perhaps not so different. Charles I ascended to the throne in 1625, carrying the burden of expectation and legacy. Everyone knew about his father's relationships, particularly with George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. The elder king's open devotion to the young duke had stirred gossip, outrage, and more than a few veiled accusations. And when James died, Charles didn't push Buckingham away. He brought him closer. The new king was a married man. He wed Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic queen whose presence stirred Protestant anxiety. But their early relationship was far from romanticate. began tense, mistrustful, politically fraught. And through it all, Charles leaned on Buckingham. Now, Buckingham wasn't just any courtier. He was handsome, charismatic, and dangerously influential. He had been molded by James I, and under Charles, his power only expanded. He ran military expeditions, advised on foreign policy, controlled patronage, and, crucially, maintained a constant physical presence at court. Charles was not an expressive man. He wasn't known for dramatic gestures or flowery language. But with Buckingham, there was something more, and the two were rarely apart. They traveled together, lived together for stretches, and spent long private hours locked in consultation. When Parliament began to question Buckingham's influence, Charles didn't retreat, doubled down. He defended the Duke with unshakable loyalty, dissolving Parliament rather than surrendering his friend. When Buckingham was assassinated in 1628, stabbed in the street by a disgruntled soldier, Charles was shattered. He reportedly locked himself away for days, refusing to eat or speak. Letters from the period reveal a grief that was personal, not political. This wasn't just a favored advisor lost it, was the emotional centerpiece of the king's inner world, torn away. And here's where it gets thorny. Was it romantic? Was it physical? Historians argue. The lack of passionate correspondence between Charles and Buckingham has led some to downplay their relationship. But others point to the king's actions, the obsessive loyalty, the protective rage, the visible grief. Charles I, a man not prone to emotional display, openly mourned Buckingham in ways he never showed for almost anyone else. His court, too, reflected peculiar choices. Like his father, Charles surrounded himself with beautiful young men in carefully curated roles, courtiers with soft hands and sharp clothes. Companions chosen not just for their political use, but for something closer to aesthetic and emotional comfort. The Queen reportedly resented these men, jealous, perhaps, of the intimacy she couldn't access. And when the English Civil War finally tore the country apart, Charles's cold exterior cracked only rarely. One of those cracks? His confessions to a select few male attendants in his final month's quiet words, handwritten prayers, affectionate goodbyes to men who had remained loyally by his side. In the end, he died not with thunder but with trembling, dignified, silent, resolved. A king who went to his death clutching not the arm of a queen, but the memory of a friendship that might have been something more. And if Charles wore his secrets like armor, our next king ruled in a time when nothing was secret for long. King Ethelred the Unready, centuries earlier, had no privacy, not in his bed, not in his council. And yet even in the dusty pages of Anglo-Saxon chronicles, hints of brotherhood and intimacy remain fragile, flickering clues that maybe, just maybe, affection has always refused to be silenced. King Ethelred the Unready. He was born into a crumbling kingdom, baptized in suspicion, and remembered by a nickname that feels like a cosmic joke, Ethelred the Unready. But that title, misleading as it is, doesn't mean what it sounds like. Unready comes from the Old English unrad, meaning poor counsel or bad advice, which, to be fair, is a decent summary of his reign. He made terrible decisions, relied on the wrong men, mismanaged war, lost the loyalty of his nobles, and let the Danes sail up England's rivers like they owned the place. But beneath the disaster of his policies lies a figure more complex than the caricature. Ethelred wasn't simply a failure, he was a king caught in an impossible age, scrambling to hold together a land, splintering beneath the weight of invasion, betrayal, and uncertainty. And in that chaos, in the courts and cloisters and smoky wooden halls of Anglo-Saxon England, we find hints of something softer, quieter, less documented. whispers of closeness that don't fit easily into the chronicles of kings and conquest. To understand Ethelred's personal life, you have to understand what intimacy looked like in the 10th and 11th centuries. This was a world where kings didn't rule from marble thrones, but from great halls lined with drinking benches and fire pits. It was communal, physical, and tactile. Lords and retainers lived together, slept in the same rooms, ate from the same trenchers, and spilled blood together on the battlefield. In that context, male closeness was norm expected even. But with Ethelred, some records hint at something deeper than camaraderie. Monastic documents refer to unusually intense brotherhoods between the king and select members of his household. These weren't blood brothers. They weren't nobles with hereditary power. They were men whose entire influence flowed from personal access to Ethelred knights, stewards, bodyguards. They appear in records not as officials but as constant presences, always traveling with him, always named first among attendants, always rewarded quietly with land or coin. One in particular, a man named Elfgar, was repeatedly described in poetic and emotionally charged language by scribes at court. Elfgar wasn't a general or bishop. He had no military reputation, no administrative authority, but he was given rare privileges, unrestricted access to the king, the right to speak in closed councils, even exemption from certain taxes. In one document, he's described with a phrase that translates roughly to, "the king's beloved." That kind of language wasn't common, even in flowery Anglo-Saxon Latin. None of this is explicit. There are no love letters, no poems scribbled in the margins. But the accumulation of clues is telling. Ethelred was a man who struggled to trust his nobles, many of whom betrayed him to the Danes, yet he placed extraordinary faith in his closest male companions. Some historians believe these attachments were simply desperate bids for loyalty. Others argue they were something more personal, genuine bonds of affection in a world where affection had to wear the mask of duty. There's also the curious fact of Ethelred's erratic marriages. He wed twice, first to Aelfgifu, who bore him many children, including Edmund Ironside, and then to Emma of Normandy, a political alliance designed to save what was left of the kingdom. But both marriages were distant, cold, pragmatic. Emma spent more time managing the succession than managing the relationship. Letters between the couple are clipped, formal, suspiciously devoid of warmth, and during both unions, Ethelred's male companions remained constant. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Ethelred's reign, when viewed through this lens, is his loneliness. The chronicles depict a man increasingly isolated, beset by betrayal, cornered by fate. The one place where he seemed to find continuity, even comfort, was with the men he kept closest. When Ethelred died in 1016, his kingdom was falling apart. The Danes would soon claim the throne. His legacy would be buried under centuries of mockery. But in the dusty folds of charters and chronicles, there's a quieter story of a man who may have reached for connection where he could, in a world that gave him no room to speak it aloud. And if Ethelred ruled with poor counsel but intense devotion, the next king ruled with calculated control and kept his favorites tucked close to the throne. Henry I knew how to manipulate power, but his fierce loyalty to a few hand-picked men has left historians wondering what, exactly, he was hiding behind his iron gaze. King Henry I. If Henry I had a motto, it might have been, "Trust no one, except the men you can't explain." He was the youngest son of William, the Conqueror, a man born into blood and ambition. By all accounts, Henry wasn't supposed to wear the crown. He inherited it only after his older brother William died in a hunting accident, a suspiciously convenient one, and his other brother, Robert, was too busy crusading to stop him. Henry seized the English throne in 1100 and then imprisoned Robert to make sure he'd never have to give it back. That's how Henry worked. Quick, decisive, cold, a ruler who didn't wait to be invited. He was ruthless in governance, relentless in strategy, and had a brain built for bureaucracy. Under Henry, England's legal system matured, the treasury expanded. Royal administration evolved into something that finally resembled actual government. But behind all that rationality, behind the ledgers and edicts and tax reforms, there was a strange, simmering tension at court. Because while Henry was famous for his womanizing more than 20 illegitimate children by at least a dozen different women, he also kept an inner circle of male companions who didn't quite fit the mold. These weren't just knights or advisors. They were men he protected fiercely, promoted swiftly, and defended when no one else would. The most infamous of these was Roger of Salisbury. Roger began as a lowly clerk, a minor church functionary. Yet Henry spotted him, favored him, and elevated him to Bishop of Salisbury, of the most powerful positions in the kingdom. Roger didn't just oversee a diocese, he effectively ran the government. He managed the royal finances, restructured the court's logistical apparatus, and served as Henry's shadow for decades. He wasn't noble. He wasn't flashy. But Henry made him indispensable. Their closeness drew attention even in their own time. Chroniclers noted the strange reliance Henry had on Roger's uncommon fondness for the bishop's company. When enemies tried to accuse Roger of corruption or incompetence, Henry brushed it off. He didn't just defend him, he closed ranks. The king, who was usually so unsentimental, so practical, showed a different face when it came to Roger. And Roger wasn't the only one. Henry filled his court with men like Geoffrey de Clinton and Robert de Beaumont, who rose faster than logic allowed. Men whose primary qualification seemed to be proximity. Men who, though lacking noble bloodlines, were granted castles, titles, and access to the king's private quarters. Henry didn't just reward these men, he wrapped them into the architecture of his rule. Now, could all of this be just good politics? Sure. Henry was a king who understood loyalty, and rewarding loyal men makes strategic sense. But the emotional weight behind some of these relationships is hard to ignore. The king, who rarely expressed warmth publicly, showed unusual patience with these favorites. He invited them to dine, to travel, to stay close when most nobles were kept at arm's length. And then there's the quiet part, Henry's dual life. While his public image was that of a hyper-virile monarch, fathering bastards left and right, his court was unusually subdued. Few court romances, few lavish queen-centered ceremonies, and even his legitimate marriage to Matilda of Scotland was described as distant and functional. Matilda was devout, intelligent, and politically astute. But she was not Henry's confidant. She wasn't the one he turned to in moments of crisis. That role, it seems, belonged to his inner circle of hand-picked men. In the end, Henry died not in battle or palace, but in Normandy, reportedly after gorging himself on lampreysen eel-like delicacy he had been warned not to eat. The king who built a government died of his appetite, which feels darkly appropriate. His body was brought back to England and buried in Reading Abbey, leaving behind a legacy of legal reform, dynastic instability, and emotional ambiguity. Was Henry gay? Probably not in the modern sense, but was he emotionally and perhaps romantically entangled with men he trusted more than his own blood? The pattern suggests yes, or at least something that doesn't neatly fit into the history textbooks. And if Henry ruled with calculated control and quiet devotion, the next king lived with extravagant chaos. George IV was all flamboyance and flair an opera of excess, velvet, and vanity. But even beneath his womanizing image, there were rumors of male companions whose intimacy may have stretched far beyond the stage curtain. King George IV. He was the king of carriages and corsets, of scandals and champagne. George IV wasn't just a monarch, he was a walking theater of indulgence, a peacock in human form, the man who turned Brighton into a playground for the aristocracy and transformed Buckingham House into the palace we know today. But for all the extravagance, all the opulence and theatrical flair, there was something just under the surface, a strange loneliness, a performative masculinity, and a trail of rumors that refused to die quietly. George IV was never meant to be subtle. Even as Prince of Wales, he cultivated an image of excess, powdered wigs, lavish jewels, absurd debts, and a revolving door of affairs. The women were numerous, high-profile, and often disastrous. There was Maria Fitzherbert, the Catholic widow he married in secret, an illegal and invalid marriage, but emotionally potent. There were actresses, duchesses, dancers, some lovers, some transactions. To the public, George was the embodiment of heterosexual appetite, a man too busy loving women to govern wisely. And yet, even as he posed for portraits beside mistresses and socialites, whispers circulated about his private life, whispers that hinted at something more complex. George had an unusually intimate relationship with certain male courtiers and artists, especially during his years as Prince of Wales. These men were not simply advisors or decorators. They were companions, confidants, attendants who remained attached to his household for far longer than their positions required. Among the most frequently mentioned were flamboyant figures from the art world, painters, designers, and musicians who shared George's love of beauty, drama, and aesthetic perfection. Many of these men were rumored to be queer, or at least gender non-conforming, and yet they operated freely within the royal sphere. George protected them, elevated them, lived with them, and in some cases, even moved them into his residences for long stretches. More tellingly, George's private parties held at Carlton House and later at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton were known for their peculiar guest lists. They included all the usual suspects, nobles, celebrities, entertainers. But nestled among them were young male performers and socialites, many of whom had no political or social reason to be there, other than it seemed their charm, their appearance, and their closeness to the prince. This wasn't mere eccentricity. These weren't court appointments. These were chosen men. And George, beneath all the velvet and varnish, was a deeply emotional figure. His letters, when they surface, show a man hungry for affection, for validation, for someone to stay. The kind of hunger that doesn't distinguish by gender, but by intimacy. Historians have long debated whether George's flamboyant lifestyle was cover or compensation. Was he trying to overperform heterosexuality to drown out deeper truths? Or was he simply a man without boundaries who loved beauty wherever he found it? What complicates the narrative further is the way his court handled these rumors. Unlike Edward VIII or James I, whose male relationships triggered political backlash, George's male attachments were never confronted directly. Instead, they were ignored, strategically, perhaps, because no one wanted to puncture the image of the glamorous, virile, larger-than-life monarch. The very absurdity of his public persona acted as camouflage. And beneath it all, George grew increasingly bitter. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster, mutual loathing, public humiliation, even courtroom drama when he tried to deny her entry to his coronation. His health collapsed in his later years. The once vibrant prince became a swollen, pained, reclusive figure, hidden from the world, surrounded once again by his personal male staff now, fewer in number, but still oddly constant. He died in 1830, bloated, ill, and emotionally empty. A man who had been loved by few and understood by even fewer. The show was over, but the curtain never quite came down. And if George IV's life was a dazzling illusion, the next king ruled in a time before illusions, before centralized monarchy, before Norman castles, before England as we know it. Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king, stood on the edge of history, and in the shadow of his fall, there remains a story of brotherhood that might have been something more. King Harold II. His reign lasted just 9 months, but his legend has lasted nearly a millennium. Harold II, last of the Anglo-Saxon kings, is best remembered for how he died. Arrow to the eye, sprawled across the battlefield at Hastings as William the Conqueror seized the English crown. But the man behind the myth was more than a tragic figure. He was a complex, hardened leader forged in a violent, uncertain world, and a man whose inner circle held a bond so tight, some historians have asked whether it was more than just camaraderie. Harold Godwinson was born into power. The son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, he belonged to one of the most influential families in pre-conquest England. His father was the kingmaker of the time, and Harold inherited that role after Godwin's death. He was bold, popular, and skilled in war. He didn't just rule with strategy, he ruled with loyalty. And that loyalty centered around a specific group of men known as thangs, noble retainers, sworn warriors, close companions in battle and in life. Among these, one name appears again and again: Leofwine, his younger brother. But Harold's relationship with his thangs, particularly his personal guard and senior household men, has drawn the attention of scholars not because of blood ties, but because of the intensity of the non-familial bonds involved. In Anglo-Saxon tradition, male intimacy wasn't taboo, it was ritualized. Oaths of loyalty were public, emotional, and performed with gestures we'd now consider romantic. Men clasped hands, embraced, even kissed during formal bonding. The mead halls weren't just places for strategy, they were theaters of affection, solidarity, and shared vulnerability. But with Harold, these connections seemed especially pronounced. During his time as Earl of Wessex and later as king, Harold surrounded himself with a tight-knit group of men who followed him everywhere. They weren't just bodyguards, they were trusted advisors, sworn warriors, and, at times, described in unusually emotional terms by contemporary chroniclers. One, in particular, an unnamed companion noted in a surviving Norman account, was described as the man most dear to Harold's private council. The chronicler, no friend to Harold, clearly meant it as a jab. But the wording is peculiar, even for medieval political smearing. Most dear to his private council suggests more than military advice. It suggests emotional reliance, intimate conversation, the kind of trust built not just on the battlefield but behind closed doors. Other reports from the time mention Harold sharing tents and sleeping quarters with a small group of these companions while on campaign. Again, not unusual for the period men shared beds, often out of necessity. But the same names appear again and again, even when other nobles were available. These weren't just the best tacticians, they were the people Harold needed close. Then there's the odd fact of Harold's marital status. He was famously married to Edith Swan, a union recognized under traditional Anglo-Saxon law but never blessed by the church. This allowed him to cast her aside later for a more politically convenient alliance with Edith of Mercia, sister to the northern earls. Yet neither relationship seemed to generate any documented affection. He had children, yes, but we know startlingly little about his emotional life with either woman. They are footnotes. The male companions, meanwhile, are ever present. And at Hastings, they stood with him to the end, not out of duty alone, but out of fierce, almost fanatical loyalty. When Harold fell, so did they cut down around him, defending his body as if protecting a fallen brother, or perhaps something more. After his death, England changed forever. The Norman conquest erased much of what came before. Harold became a legend, a martyr, a cautionary tale. But the man behind the myth was never just a king. He was a leader whose heart seemed bound not by alliances, but by bonds forged in fire, mead, and something deeper than duty. And while Harold died with his companions beside him, the next king never even lived long enough to know what he truly desired. Edward Vitheboy King left behind no wife, no heirs, but one very curious friendship that's still raising eyebrows centuries later. King Edward VI. He was England's youngest male monarch, and one of its briefest, crowned at 9, dead at 15. A boy king caught in the undertow of religious revolution, political factionalism, and looming mortality. Edward VI ruled in a time of convulsive change when Protestantism was being carved into the bones of English society, and every decision came laced with consequences. And yet, even as he sat atop this religious reformation like a paper crown, Edward left behind a much quieter legacy. One shaped not by politics or pulpit, but by a singular, devoted relationship with another young man. Enter Barnaby Fitzpatrick. The name doesn't leap from the pages of most textbooks, but Fitzpatrick was more than just a footnote. He was Edward's childhood companion, his whipping boy, and perhaps the only person who truly knew the real Edward the boy behind the crown. The concept of a whipping boy is strange to modern eyes. A noble child was too sacred to be punished, so when he misbehaved, another boy, his equal in status but not in position, was beaten in his place. The theory was that watching someone suffer on your behalf would inspire guilt, remorse, and reform. In practice, it often created bonds that were deep, emotional, and unlike any modern friendship. Barnaby Fitzpatrick was chosen for this role not just because of his social standing, but because of his character. He was loyal, intelligent, and unwaveringly devoted to Edward. The two boys were raised together, learned together, and, by all accounts, became inseparable. Letters between them survive unusual for their openness, their warmth, and their tone of shared trust. One letter from Edward, sent after Barnaby was sent to France as a noble emissary, reads less like royal correspondence and more like a yearning message between two parted souls. Edward calls him "my second self," and writes with a tenderness that's striking given the strict, repressed court environment he lived in. He begs for news, jokes about court life, and expresses frustration that his companion is gone. Now, Edward VI was no fool. Despite his age, he was an intense, brilliant thinker fluent in Latin, obsessed with theology, and painfully aware of his role as a divine ruler. His journal, stark and precise, reveals a boy trying to will himself into adulthood. But amid the scribbles about executions and sermons, there's a softness when it comes to Barnaby. An ache. A familiarity too rich to dismiss as childhood affection. And it's not just the tone of the letters, it's the content. Edward trusted Barnaby in ways he trusted no one else. He sent him as his personal envoy. He defended him at court. When advisors whispered that Fitzpatrick was growing too bold abroad, too free with French courtiers, Edward bristled, demanding respect for his friend. That kind of defense from a monarch wasn't just rare, it was dangerous. But Edward was already on borrowed time. By age 15, he was wasting away, likely from tuberculosis. his face hollowed, his skin turned pale. He began drafting devise for the succession, desperate to stop his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne. But even as he wrote laws and treaties with trembling hands, he still found time to write to Barnaby. And then, silence. Edward died in 1553, childless and barely more than a child himself. History remembers him as a Protestant puppet or a tragic figure, but rarely as a boy with real emotions, real desires, and a connection that may have meant everything. Was Edward in love with Barnaby? It's impossible to say with certainty. But was theirs a bond that went beyond politics, beyond education, beyond mere court friendship? Undeniably. In a court ruled by power, theirs was a relationship ruled by care, and in a monarchy where affection was currency, Edward gave Barnaby everything he could: his trust, his voice, his vulnerability. And if Edward VI's reign flickered out too soon, our next figure never even reached the throne but might have changed it forever. Prince Albert Victor, heir to the empire, lived a life of privilege and mystery. But when his name surfaced in the scandal of a secret brothel, the future of the crown itself trembled. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. History has a habit of burying its most interesting figures beneath ambiguity, and few have been buried deeper, both figuratively and literally, than Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of Edward VII and the grandson of Queen Victoria. Albert Victor, nicknamed Eddie by his family, was born second in line to the British throne. He was royalty at its most poised, tall, well-dressed, well-bred, groomed for greatness, raised for the crown. But behind the tailored suits and royal smiles, Eddie was wrapped in layers of speculation, whisper, and rumor that began during his short life and haven't stopped in the more than 130 years since his death. He was the heir who never reigned, the prince who never ruled. And depending on which version of history you read, he was either a sensitive soul crushed by expectation or the center of one of the most enduring queer mysteries in British royal history. The story starts quietly. Eddie was delicate physically and emotionally, not unintelligent, but unfocused. He passed through Cambridge and Sandhurst without distinction, known more for his social charm than academic or military rigor. He was popular with friends, especially those within artistic and theatrical circles. He had a softness about him that clashed with Victorian masculinity. And, most tellingly, he had a pattern of keeping company with young men who were never quite explained. But the real turning point, the moment that cracked his legacy wide open, came in 1889, when a scandal shook London society to its core: the Cleveland Street affair. It started as a routine investigation into a male brothel operating out of 19 Cleveland Street. As the investigation widened, it ensnared postal workers, guardsmen, and most alarmingly a growing list of elite clients. Rumors flew like sparks that members of the aristocracy had visited, that names were being scrubbed, that someone powerful was behind the suppression of evidence. And then, suddenly, whispers turned to thunder. Prince Albert Victor, heir to the throne, was rumored to be one of the patrons. No official record ever confirmed his involvement. No charges were brought. In fact, the entire investigation was quickly smothered. Files vanished. Witnesses recanted. The brothel's owner fled. But the rumor didn't die. It evolved. Fueled by silence, fueled by panic, fueled by the uncanny way the scandal seemed to evaporate just as it threatened the monarchy itself. Was Eddie guilty? No proof. Was he protected? Almost certainly. The timing was too neat, the files too clean. Victorian England, after all, couldn't survive a homosexual scandal at the heart of its monarchy, not in an era where Oscar Wilde would be imprisoned just a few years later for far less. Adding fuel to the fire were Eddie's close, lifelong friendships with certain male courtiers. These weren't official companions or political allies. They were men who shared his private hours, traveled with him, remained in his orbit, while others rotated out. His letters to them, when they surface, are tender, careful, intimate, in a way that feels deeply personal and intentionally obscured. His engagement to Princess Mary, the future Queen Mary, was announced but never completed. Before they could marry, Eddie caught influenza likely during the global pandemic of 1892 and died suddenly at just 28 years old. His body was buried at Windsor Castle beneath a sculpture of breathtaking beauty and melancholy, crafted by Alfred Gilbert. The statue depicts an angel bending mournfully over his tomb, more romantic than regal. And just like that, he was gone. The prince who might have been king. The man whose personal life was edited out of history even before the ink was dry. But his ghost lingered. Some conspiracy theorists, wrongly, named him as Jack the Ripper. Others whispered that he had faked his death to escape blackmail. But more sober minds simply noted the strangeness of his story, the softness, the silences, the suggestion of love he was never allowed to express. Albert Victor lived a life of shadows, groomed to rule, but never built to survive the expectations. He was too fragile for the crown, too gentle for the court, and perhaps too visible for the feelings he had to hide. And if Eddie's life ended in a veil of rumor, the next prince followed a similar script, only this time with even more style. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was glamorous, gifted, and famously enigmatic. And when the rumors came for him, they included not just whispered names, but one as loud and glittering as Noel Coward. Prince George, Duke of Kent. He had the face of a movie star and the life of a mystery novel. Prince George, Duke of Kent, lived in the shadows of Buckingham Palace, but shimmered like a Hollywood marquee. Stylish, charming, and relentlessly elusive, George was the fourth son of King George V and the younger brother of two kings, Edward VIII, the romantic abdicator, and George VI, the reluctant wartime ruler. He was royalty, yes, but also something else entirely. An enigma, a whisper, a name that never stopped dancing just on the edge of scandal. Born into Edwardian splendor but coming of age in the roaring 20s, Prince George was the first truly modern royal. He dressed like a Vogue spread come to life. Tailored suits, slicked back hair, high cheekbones, cigarette in hand, he was a fashion icon before the concept even existed. He spoke multiple languages. He played the piano. He dabbled in art and design. He knew the value of an entrance and the thrill of a well-timed silence. But it wasn't just style that made George stand out. It was what people said or didn't say about him. Unlike his older brothers, George didn't settle into a single public role. He oscillated between military service, diplomatic missions, and social circles that defied classification. He was known in aristocratic salons and artistic lounges. He was as comfortable in an embassy as he was at a costume ball. And wherever he went, rumors followed. The most persistent of these rumors revolved around his alleged relationships with men, most famously, the playwright and performer Noel Coward. Coward was everything the royal family wasn't supposed to be. Openly flamboyant, proudly witty, and deeply enmeshed in London's queer underground. He moved in theatrical circles, smoked with artists, and penned plays that pushed boundaries. And yet, somehow, Prince George gravitated to him. Or maybe it was the other way around. Their relationship has never been officially confirmed. No letters have surfaced, No photos, nothing concrete, but the pattern is impossible to ignore. They traveled in the same circles, attended the same parties, and were regularly spotted together in places that respectable princes weren't supposed to go. According to accounts from people close to both men, their relationship was affectionate, emotionally intense, and, at times, romantic. Some memoirs, carefully worded and edited by nervous publishers, describe late-night visits, quiet conversations in private gardens, and shared weekends in secluded estates. Nothing explicit, but everything suggestive. And Coward wasn't the only one. George's personal life was filled with unusually close friendships with men who weren't just aides or guards or advisors. They were confidants. His inner circle was rich with dancers, designers, and young actors. Men with style, talent, and little political relevance. They stayed close, sometimes too close for comfort, in a monarchy that prized discretion over all else. It didn't help that George had a history of troubled behavior substance issues, rumors of affairs with both men and women, and at least one documented scandal involving morphine. The royal family, with its arsenal of PR tools, swept most of it away. But even the palace couldn't erase everything, especially not the part where he always seemed more alive in the company of artists than aristocrats. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, George married. In 1934, he wed Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, a sophisticated, cosmopolitan royal who seemed to understand what she was signing up for. They had 3 children, including the current Duke of Kent. The marriage functioned, but it never glowed. And then came the war. In 1942, George was serving with the Royal Air Force when his plane crashed in the Scottish Highlands. Officially, it was a routine flight. Unofficially, speculation ignited like wildfire. Some said the crash was an accident. Others suggested sabotage. Still others, in hushed tones, claimed he wasn't meant to be on the plane at all. But one detail remained. Among the passengers was a man of no military rank whose presence was never explained. Prince George died at 39, young, glamorous, and wrapped in silence. The palace mourned, the press kept quiet, and the files, those that might have explained who he really was, were sealed. But the legacy lingers, in photo albums, in footnotes, in the aching gaps of biographies that say close friend when they might mean something else entirely. And if George's story ended in mystery, the next royal lived an even quieter contradiction. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, never graced the headlines like his brother. But during his years abroad and in uniform, his closeness with certain men raised questions that were never asked out loudly, written in the margins of history. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. He was the quiet one, the dutiful one, the royal who stayed in the background, never reaching for headlines, never stepping out of lineage, least not officially. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, 3rd son of King George V, spent his life upholding the institution that defined him. He didn't abdicate, he didn't scandalize. He served obediently, silently, almost invisibly. But sometimes silence says more than any scream. Born just before the turn of the century, Henry grew up in a palace filled with hierarchy, hush, and carefully regimented affection. His father, George V, ran the royal household like a naval vessel, cold, efficient, and emotionally stingy. Henry, always a bit more reserved than his brothers, adapted well to the role expected of him. Reliable, loyal, background furniture to the crown. His life was a string of uniforms: Eton, Sandhurst, the army, the court. But under the surface, there was more going on than medals and manners. He was considered the handsome brother. Strong jaw, athletic build, classically royal features. And as a young man, he spent a significant amount of time abroad, especially during his military postings in Africa and Australia, posts that, while framed as service, also functioned as a kind of exile. Away from prying London eyes. Away from the pressure of press photographers and Parliament whispers. Away from the control of his ever-watchful family. It's during these postings that the questions begin. While stationed overseas, Henry reportedly developed close, intense relationships with several fellow officers. These weren't just friendships built on shared barracks and battlefield loyalty. These were relationships that continued after deployments ended. The same men reappeared in letters, photographs, and court records, usually marked as companions or private secretaries. And in some cases, they were quietly granted lifetime pensions or discreet royal positions upon return to the UK. One of the most curious aspects of these friendships was their emotional texture. Correspondence, what little survives, shows a degree of personal warmth unusual in royal documentation. Phrases like "your ever-devoted friend" and "thinking of you constantly" drift across the pages. Again, nothing overt, but striking in their persistence, especially from a man raised to show almost no vulnerability at all. Even within the royal household, Henry was known for preferring the company of men. His social engagements were minimal, his connection with society, women non-existent. Unlike his brother Edward VIII, who was constantly linked to scandalous mistresses, or George VI, who built a very traditional royal family, Henry remained, for years, unattached. When he did marry, finally, at age 39, it was to Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott, a highly respectable, deeply private aristocrat. Their wedding was quiet, almost secretive, and postponed several times for unclear reasons. The marriage lasted, and they had 2 children. But the emotional heartbeat of Henry's life never quite seemed to revolve around the domestic sphere. He wasn't cold, but he was distant, detached. His biographers often describe him as duty-bound and stoic, but even those words feel like placeholders. The better ones admit the truth. We don't really know him, because Henry made sure we couldn't. During World War II, he took on various ceremonial roles. Later, he served as Governor-General of Australia, a position that kept him overseas, far from London's scrutiny. His time there was marked by political restraint and social privacy. Again, a pattern. Again, the quiet man flanked by a close circle of male aides, rarely photographed with his wife, frequently seen out riding, walking, conversing at length with 1 or 2 individuals whose names barely survived the footnotes. When he returned to England, he retreated into the kind of obscurity only a royal can achieve, visible but unknowable. He died in 1974, long after the headlines had moved on. His funeral was dignified, his legacy sealed inside vaults that would never be opened. But behind the medals, behind the marriage, behind the royal mask, there lingers a subtle, persistent question. Who did Prince Henry really love? And while his story faded into silence, the next royal remains alive his life, a living record of a modern monarchy still caught between tradition and truth. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, has walked the fine line between public duty and private rumor for decades, and through it all, the questions have never quite stopped following him. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. He has lived through more royal eras than most monarchs did. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was born into an empire still cloaked in colonial power, and now stands as one of its oldest living. Relics quiet, formal, enduring. As the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, Edward has been a loyal servant to the crown for over 70 years. But even loyalty wears a mask. Behind the uniformed appearances, the handshakes, and the state visits lies a life defined not by scandal, but by sustained speculation. Because even as he marched through history with military posture, a cloud of gentle, persistent rumor followed just a step behind. From his earliest years, Edward was cast in the same mold as many male Windsors before him: naval service, private education, polite detachment. He was raised in the long shadow of his father, Prince George, Duke of Kent the Handsome, charismatic royal, who died mysteriously in a 1942 plane crash and whose own legacy came with whispers of same-sex affairs and secret lovers. It's hard not to wonder how much of that legacy shaped the son who inherited his title. Edward has always been intensely private, even by royal standards. Never flashy, never political, rarely quoted. He appears at military commemorations, chairs obscure royal charities, and often shows up at events dressed like a vintage postcard smart suit, quiet gaze, medal precisely placed. He has walked a careful line for decades, showing up without ever showing himself. And yet, that's exactly why people started talking. In royal circles, silence can be louder than words. Over the years, observers began noting Edward's enduring closeness to a small, rotating circle of male friends. Companions who attended events with him, traveled alongside him, and were seen repeatedly by his side at private functions, yet never publicly acknowledged with any clear role or title. These weren't aides or equerries. They were confidants. Some of these friendships spanned decades, continuing quietly in the background, while Edward's public life remained stoic and unchanging. In a royal family where everyone is always watching everyone else, the Duke of Kent seemed uniquely shielded not because the world wasn't curious, but because his quietness was so complete it became impenetrable. Then came the inevitable comparisons to his father, Prince George, to his cousin, Edward VIII, to others in the royal line whose relationships raised eyebrows but never reached the headlines. The palace never addressed the rumors, not once, not when tabloids tiptoed around them in coded language, not when biographers danced near the subject with euphemisms like deep friendship and unmarried intimacy. But Edward wasn't unmarried. In 1961, he wed Catherine Worsley, a schoolteacher's daughter turned duchess. They had 3 children, and by royal standards, the marriage seemed respectably subdued. Over time, Catherine quietly converted to Catholicism, causing a minor constitutional stir. Catholics, after all, are technically barred from ascending to the throne. Still, she remained married to Edward, though the couple gradually adopted separate routines. While Catherine withdrew from most royal duties, Edward carried on steadily, formally, and always flanked by male staff. His presence in the family has been one of quiet permanence, never the center of attention, but always nearby. He's represented the Queen at funerals, stood in for state events, cut ribbons, laid wreaths. He's a man designed for photos, not headlines. But in the background, the same question has gently persisted. Who is Edward Kent, really? There's no scandal, no leaked letter, no intercepted phone call or paparazzi ambush. Just patterns, absences, loyalty where intimacy might hide. And in a family where privacy is weaponized and silence is survival, that might be the clearest truth of all. As the 21st century crawls forward and the old guard begins to fade, Edward stands as one of the last living threads connecting the present to a royal past still ruled by secrecy. And while he may never confirm anything, his life, like so many others, remains marked by a single, unspoken tension: the distance between how you serve and who you are. And if Edward's story is still unfolding, Our next royal lived with a sword in one hand and a pen in the other. Prince Rupert of the Rhine wasn't just a warrior. Princi was an artist, a romantic, and in many eyes a man who poured too much feeling into his male friendships to be written off as mere camaraderie. Prince Rupert of the Rhine. He was born during a thunderstorm, a child of war and royalty, and the drama never stopped. Prince Rupert of the Rhine came into the world surrounded by dynasties, exiles, and gunpowder. Nephew to King Charles I, grandson of James I, and cousin to both Charles II and James I, Rupert belonged to the tangled, volatile web of European nobility that ran on bloodlines and battlefields. And while history remembers him as a military command-era cavalier dashing across the English Civil War on horseback, his life was far richer and far stranger than any single title can explain. Rupert was a contradiction, a brilliant soldier and a failed admiral, a ruthless strategist and a sentimental poet, a man who could kill at dawn and paint at dusk. He fought with fire and flirted with invention. He dabbled in science, introduced mezzotint to England, and invented military gadgets no one asked for. And yet, amid all the smoke and steel, Rupert's personal life held a quiet, persistent melodeon that hummed beneath the cannon fire. Rupert never married, not officially, not politically, not even when it would have benefited him enormously. That's strange for a prince so deeply embedded in dynastic politics. He had affairs with women of various stations, including the English actress Margaret Hughes, who bore him a daughter. But none of these relationships seemed to carry the emotional gravity that surrounded his most intimate male friendships. The one most often discussed is his bond with Henry Jermyn. Jermyn was a courtier, a diplomat, and the kind of figure who moved through courts with a velvet slipper and a dagger behind his back. He was, by many accounts, openly queer in a time when such things were deadly, and his connection with Rupert was more than political alliance. They lived together for a period, traveled together, shared quarters during campaigns, exchanged letters, many of which have mysteriously vanished, leaving behind only tantalizing clues in diaries and second-hand references. Other male friendships followed the same pattern. Young men of talent or charm who appeared suddenly in Rupert's life were granted titles or commissions and then lingered long past their official usefulness. One companion named Richardi's full title lost to histories was described by contemporaries as Rupert's shadow. Another, a painter and inventor named Waller, collaborated with Rupert in artistic experiments and stayed by his side even during his least glamorous postings. Rupert's letters that do survive are unusually expressive. His language is passionate, even poetic. While no document confesses anything directly, the tone often feels just a breath shy of romantic. He writes of missing faces, of aching when separated, of feeling unwhole in the absence of his companion. For a man known on the battlefield as Mad Rupert, these were not the writings of a hardened killer. They were the words of someone who loved intensely and without easy labels. He lived most of his later years in England, occasionally returning to command during foreign wars, but slowly retreating into a life of study and creation. He was made Constable of Windsor Castle and quietly filled the rooms with his experiments alchemy, chemistry, metallurgy. He died in his bed at age 62 with little fanfare but considerable mystery. No great royal funeral, no dynastic drama, just silence. And maybe that's how he wanted it. Rupert never fit the mold, not as a prince, not as a lover, not as a legacy. He belonged to a time of strict roles and violent expectations, yet somehow managed to carve out a private world of art, intimacy, and deep, complicated affection. Was Prince Rupert gay? Maybe. Was he deeply bonded to men in ways that stretched beyond politics and into love? almost certainly. But like many royals, he left behind just enough ambiguity to ensure his heart remained untouchable by history's harshest hands. And if Rupert lived in the passionate blur between art and war, the next prince stood at the edge of the Victorian Ordera bachelor, forever traveling, forever accompanied, and forever labeled unmarriageable. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, didn't need a scandal to raise eyebrows. All he had to do was keep his secrets a little too well. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught. He was the son of a queen and the uncle of a dozen monarchs. Yet Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathern, remains one of the most quietly elusive members of the British royal family. Born in 1850 to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Arthur was bred for duty, dressed for diplomacy, and deployed to the furthest corners of the empire. He lived to the age of 91, a remarkable stretch for a man who watched the sun rise and set on the British Empire. But even in all that time, he never married his public image to any real intimacy. And that absence, the long, careful absence, has only deepened the mystery around him. Arthur was Victoria's favorite son. Not the heir that role belonged to his older brother Edward, but the most reserved, the most obedient, the most manageable. He was placed in the army at a young age, a career that fit him perfectly. Regimented, masculine, hierarchical, emotionally distant, he rose through the ranks not simply by blood but by competence. He served with real distinction in India, Canada, and South Africa, and held senior commands throughout his life. Later, he became Governor-General of Canada, where his term was remembered less for policy than for polished appearances and an impeccable wardrobe. He was a model royal, uncontroversial, dutiful, distant, but not invisible. In an era when royalty was expected to marry young and secure dynastic alliances, Arthur's lifelong bachelorhood became more than a curiosity. It became a problem. Court gossip turned clinical. Why wasn't Victoria's favorite son married? Why did he travel constantly with the same handful of male companions, often staying with them for years? Why was he always surrounded by secretaries, aides, and military officers whose careers seemed less about politics and more about proximity? The answers never came, because Arthur was a master of discretion. His private life, his letters, his journals, his schedules was managed with the precision of a military campaign. Nothing slipped. Nothing leaked, yet his contemporaries left behind breadcrumbs. One such trail came from the diaries of court officials, who described Arthur's inner circle as curiously insular, and noted that his affection for certain officers was of unusual strength. These weren't just men who worked for him. They were men who accompanied him on private holidays, served as his constant companions, and remained in his household for decades. One was described as always at the Duke's side, even when protocol did not require it. That kind of phrasing, carefully constructed, yet undeniably pointed, was a Victorian way of lighting a flare without sparking a fire. Arthur also had a curious reputation in court society. Charming, respectful, yet unavailable. Women of noble birth were routinely presented to him, and yet he remained politely indifferent. Suitors came and went. None gained traction. His lack of scandal wasn't a sign of innocence. It was the mark of a man who kept his life under total control. The only time his bachelor status triggered public concern was during his tenure as Governor-General of Canada. A head of state without a wife was awkward enough. A head of state with a male entourage and no clear domestic anchor? That was something else. Newspapers speculated quietly. Canadian high society, ever polite, took notice. Still, no one said anything openly. Arthur, after all, was a prince, and princes were never accusingly admired from a distance. He eventually did marry, at the relatively late age of 38, to Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. It was a suitable materistocratic, diplomatic, and by all accounts, emotionally lukewarm. They had 3 children. The marriage functioned, but it never burned. Arthur outlived his wife by 2 decades. In his final years, he continued to travel, continued to keep the company of his male friends, and continued to give nothing away. When he died in 1942, he left behind a royal legacy scrubbed of scandal, yet rich in unspoken subtext. No drama, no confession, just a prince who moved through the world surrounded by men who seemed to mean more than the records admit. And if Arthur's life was one long, well-managed omission, the next prince made less effort to hide. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, walked the line between flamboyance and farce, surrounding himself with artists and actors and giving the tabloids of the Georgian era plenty to speculate about. Prince Frederick, Duke of York. He was the second son of George III and the man immortalized in a nursery rhyme. The grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. It's a catchy tune, but it hides a truth that's far more complex and far more intriguing. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, and Albany wasn't just a military figure with a marching problem. He was a royal who stood at the crossroads of power, performance, and the peculiar ambiguity of Georgian masculinity. And his life, once examined closely, begins to shimmer with hints of quiet rebellion and coded affection. Frederick was, by all outward measures, the quintessential royal general. He was made a field marshal at just 17. By 30, he was commander-in-chief of the British Army. His task? Rebuild the military into a force capable of standing up to Napoleon and do it while draped in gold-braided uniforms and courtly expectations. He embraced both challenges with enthusiasm, if not consistent success. His military record was mixed, but his administrative reforms were crucial. He professionalized officer training and helped weed out the worst excesses of aristocratic privilege in the army ranks. But while Frederick's military work placed him firmly in the center of British power, his personal life constantly hovered just outside the traditional frame. He married once Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia. The union was arranged, strategic, and spectacularly cold. The couple separated within 3 years, never had children, and lived entirely apart for the remainder of their lives. For a man second in line to the throne, that was a serious deviation from protocol. Royal marriages, especially in the 18th century, weren't supposed to be passionate, but they were supposed to produce heirs. Frederick's didn't, and no second attempt was ever made. So where did he direct his energy? According to his contemporaries, Frederick spent an extraordinary amount of time in London's more flamboyant cultural circles, specifically among theater people, artists, musicians, and the kind of well-dressed men who were known less for their bloodlines than their charm. He was a frequent presence at soirees hosted by aristocratic patrons of the arts, and his name was quietly whispered in connection with a few notable figures in those scenes. One recurring figure in those whispers was an Italian castrato singer who performed regularly in London and was reportedly seen exiting Frederick's private residence on more than one occasion. Another was a flamboyant painter who produced portraits of Frederick with a tenderness not usually reserved for military men. Now, it's entirely possible that these relationships were platonic. Georgian England was a world where male friendship could be physically affectionate and deeply emotional without necessarily being romantic. Men exchanged kisses, slept in the same beds, wrote poetic letters. But Frederick's circle was repeatedly described as flamboyant, unconventional, and entirely theatrical. In short, his entourage was not what the military or the monarchy typically endorsed. And then there were the gambling clubs. Frederick was infamous for his love of cards, betting, and late-night socializing. Many of the exclusive clubs he frequented were male-only affairs, filled with aristocrats, artists, and actors. These weren't rowdy pubs, they were refined spaces of masculinity where appearances were everything and secrets were currency. It was in these clubs, historians believe, that Frederick felt most at home, not just because of the gaming tables, but because of the freedom to shed royal formality. Despite his lavish lifestyle, Frederick remained beloved by the army, earning a reputation as a soldier's general, generous, loyal, and deeply respected. When he died in 1827, his funeral was grand, attended by legions of officers and nobles alike. He left behind no heirs, no memoirs, and no public confession, but what he did leave behind was a carefully managed legacy full of soft contradictions. The military man who adored art, the royal duke who never returned to his wife, the man in uniform always flanked by charming companions who didn't quite fit the frame. And if Frederick's story ended in whispered flourishes and social secrets, the next prince took things one step further, crossing borders, touring the continent, and forming bonds that were more than just diplomatic. Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, surrounded himself with artists and opera singers and let the rumors follow him like perfume through the palaces of Europe. Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh. He wasn't meant to rule. He wasn't meant to lead armies. And yet, Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, managed to live a royal life that felt strangely modern, restless, cosmopolitan, and quietly unconventional. The younger brother of King George III, William Henry, operated on the margins of monarchy, too close to power to be ignored, too far removed to be properly controlled, and as he traveled across Europe with his entourage of artists and operatic companions, he cultivated a lifestyle that hinted at something more than courtly eccentricity, something more intimate, something more deliberately concealed. Born in 1743 into the height of Hanoverian power, William Henry was part of a generation of princes raised with stiff collars, Enlightenment tutors, and the crushing expectations of royal masculinity. His older brother George was destined for the throne. William, like many spare sons, was pushed into military service. But unlike his contemporaries, William didn't find his identity in battle or governance. He found it in escape. From an early age, William displayed a clear preference for continental life. While the British court lumbered along in powdered formality, William slipped away to Italy, France, and the German states, places where the aristocracy mingled with musicians, where café society blurred the lines between art and identity, where being different wasn't a death sentence, just another kind of performance. And he performed well. In Rome, Venice, Florence, his name turned up frequently, always in the company of painters, composers, and young noblemen of indeterminate role. These men weren't aides or ambassadors. They were dancers, vocalists, decorators, and they didn't just appear at his parties, they traveled with him, shared his quarters, and were quietly subsidized by his estate. One of the most consistent companions in his travels was a Neapolitan singer of remarkable beauty and ambiguous origins. He was listed in records simply as Giovanni. And though little of his formal biography survives, his presence is hard to miss. Portraits commissioned during this period, painted with a gentle hand and striking intimacy, feature Giovanni beside the prince in pastoral settings, sometimes touching, always posed with the kind of familiarity that suggests more than employment. William Henry's household staff in these years was structured unusually. Domestic records from his villa in Italy show payments made not to lords or titled companions, but to young men painters, musicians, writers whose talents didn't extend beyond the artistic or aesthetic. Their tenure was long, their presence near constant, and their dismissal when it came was always followed by sudden gifts, pensions, or well-timed transfers to other aristocratic homes. The British royal family, predictably, didn't approve. George III was a monarch obsessed with propriety and lineage. William's behavior abroad, his failure to marry, his choice of companions, his ever-growing distance from official duty frustrated the king endlessly. When William eventually did marry, it was in secret, to Maria Walpole, a commoner and widow. The union, kept hidden for years, was both an act of love and defiance. By marrying without royal consent, William violated the newly passed Royal Marriages Act of 1772, a law created in direct response to his union. And even this late marriage, however genuine, did little to stifle the rumors. His emotional energy remained directed elsewhere. Even as he fathered children and returned briefly to court life, his private residences remained filled with the same male circle: artists, stewards, confidants, all indistinct in role but consistent in closeness. He died in 1805, largely out of the public eye. There were no national tributes, no monuments, just a quiet, royal funeral for a prince whose life had drifted too far from tradition to be celebrated and too well managed to be condemned. Was Prince William Henry gay? History won't say. It prefers its royals straight, tragic, or scandalous, not ambiguous. But the man himself left behind more than enough suggestion. A life lived in Italian villas, portraits filled with male affection, and a carefully curated quietness that feels like its own kind of answer. And if William Henry's legacy was brushed neatly under the carpet, the next royal barely had time to create one at all. Prince John, youngest son of George V, lived only 14 years, but in that short life, his emotional world unfolded within the rare intimacy of caregivers and companions who may have known him more deeply than history ever allowed. Prince John. He was the royal the world forgot, the prince without a place, the child tucked away from public view, remembered only in fragments and family footnotes. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, lived a brief, quiet life shaped more by absence than presence. But within that hidden world, surrounded by gardens, nurses, and silence, John formed emotional bonds that hint at something far more profound than most royal biographies dare to explore. Born into the modern British monarchy in 1905, John was a Windsor in name, but not in image. At first, he was just another royal baby fifth in line to the throne, the sixth child of a reigning king and queen. But as he grew, it became apparent that John was not like his siblings. He struggled with learning. He was prone to seizures. Eventually, doctors diagnosed him with epilepsy, a condition loaded with misunderstanding and social stigma. In a royal household obsessed with appearances, this was considered an existential threat. So they did what royal institutions have always done with uncomfortable truths. They hid him. By age 11, John was removed from court life entirely and relocated to Wood Farm, a secluded cottage on the Sandringham estate. There, he was cared for by a small, carefully selected staff. No royal engagements, no education at Eton, no official portraits after childhood, just peace, isolation, and the quiet rhythms of the countryside. But Prince John's story didn't end in erasure. At Wood Farm, something unusual happened. Away from the palace machinery and dynastic expectations, John began to form authentic emotional connections, particularly with his caregivers, most notably his nurse, Lala Bill, Charlotte Bill, and a rotating group of male attendants who served as his companions, protectors, and in some cases, his only friends. Lala Bill became John's surrogate mother, but it was the young male attendants, some only slightly older than John himself, who occupied a different emotional space. These were men who didn't just care for him. They spent nearly every waking hour in his presence. They read with him, played with him, walked through fields and forests. Saturday by his bedside through long, painful seizures. They were not nobles or courtiers. They had no power or prestige, but they had constancy, and for John, constancy was everything. The records we have are sparse. Royal journals refer to John's caregivers by first names only, or vague titles like page or attendant. Photographs from the period, when they exist, show him always in close proximity to one or two young men, rarely his siblings, rarely adults outside his trusted circle. Some later fictionalizations and dramatizations, like those seen in historical novels and television, have imagined these relationships as emotionally romantic or even subtly queer in nature. That may be a stretch, but the fact that such interpretations exist at all speaks volumes about the emotional texture left behind. What's undeniable is that John's world, limited as it was, revolved around these men. The monarchy, in its cold efficiency, couldn't accept John publicly, but the people in his immediate life loved him deeply. And he loved them back with the kind of raw, unfiltered intensity that only children or the unguarded can give. When John died in 1919, following a severe epileptic seizure at age 13, the family response was telling. Queen Mary reportedly said, "Now all my troubles are over." George V visited the grave once, but Lala Bill never stopped mourning. And the young men who had shared those long, silent days at Wood Farm, whose names we'll never fully know, were quietly dismissed from royal service shortly after his death. No honors, no titles, just memories. John was erased not because he brought shame, but because he broke the script. He couldn't perform monarchy, couldn't fit the image. But in the corners of his brief life, surrounded by warmth, touch, and unconditional affection, he created a kingdom of his own, small, private, real. And if John's bonds were quiet and childlike, the next royals were fiercely emotional, forged in the fires of adolescence. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, died young, but left behind letters so charged with devotion they've kept historians wondering ever since. Was this simply brotherhood or something more powerful and far more complicated? Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. History mourns him as the golden boy who never ruled, the star-crossed prince whose early death changed the course of a dynasty. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, eldest son of King James I and Queen Anne of Denmark, was poised to inherit not just the throne, but the hopes of a nation. He was everything his father wasn't: bold, athletic, Protestant, pleasing, and endlessly admired. He glowed with promise, adored by poets, courtiers, and the public alike. Yet beneath the halo of heroic expectation lies something more human and more elusive: a young man's private world, filled with affection, intensity, and at least one male friendship so charged with feeling that it refuses to be explained away. Born in 1594, Henry was raised under the microscope of Jacobean politics. His father, James I, was controversial Scottish-born, courtly, and openly devoted to a string of male favorites, most famously George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. By contrast, Henry was sculpted into England's perfect heir: devout, disciplined, charming, and physically striking. He was the hope of the Protestant elite and a counterbalance to his father's perceived indulgences. But Henry wasn't just a figurehead in training. He was also, crucially, a teenager, and, like many teens, he sought connection wherever he could find it. That connection took shape in his relationship with Robert Devereux, 3rd Earl of Essex, Devereux, only a few years older than Henry, had also been raised in the orbit of court politics. The two shared a classical education, a love of sports and chivalric ideals, and the rare bond of boys expected to become legends before they'd even lived. Their relationship deepened quickly and visibly. They trained together, hunted together, debated theology and strategy, and most tellingly, wrote to each other in ways that no tutor would have approved. Henry's letters to Devereux are full of emotional candor expressing longing, admiration, and at times possessiveness. He writes of missing your presence daily and longing to hear your thoughts again. At a time when male friendships were often affectionate in tone, Henry's words still stand out for their near-erotic tension and open vulnerability. Some historians argue that these letters reflect the style of Renaissance friendship, poetic, dramatic, but not necessarily romantic. Others point out how Henry's expressions toward Devereux, particularly his repeated assurances that no other company could satisfy him, go well beyond courtly language. They read like the confessions of a boy in love, or at the very least, a boy in emotional dependency that transcended standard friendship. And Devereux wasn't the only young man who occupied Henry's attention. His household was filled with carefully chosen male companion pages, stewards, fellow students, many of whom stayed close for long stretches of time and were rewarded with positions or stipends. These weren't just tutors or retainers. They were part of an inner world Henry built for himself, one that let him express what court life demanded he repress. Interestingly, Queen Anne Henry's mother was said to have been both fond of and wary of her son's intense friendships. Though no scandal was ever publicly whispered, Anne reportedly attempted to encourage more traditional socializing with noble families, particularly young women. But Henry remained emotionally tethered to his circle of boys, his confidants, his carefully curated court within the court. Then, suddenly, everything ended. In 1612, at just 18, Henry fell ill, most likely of typhoid fever, though theories have ranged from poisoning to undiagnosed illness. His death devastated the nation. Mourners lined the streets. Poets eulogized him as a second Arthur. His younger brother, the more reserved Charles, inherited the title and eventually the throne. Henry's letters were tucked away, his friendships reframed in platonic light, and the version of him that lived on was the ideal. The warrior prince, the Protestant hero, the son England never got. But the real Henry, vulnerable, emotional, perhaps yearning in a way no one dared name, remained buried beneath layers of mythology and selective memory. And if Henry Frederick's passion lived only on paper, the next name on our list lived loudly at court: Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Best known as Queen Elizabeth I's favorite, Dudley played the role of suitor by day. But by night, he was the center of a male circle, so tight, even foreign ambassadors couldn't help but raise a finely plucked brow. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. He is remembered as the man who almost married a queen. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was Queen Elizabeth I's lifelong companion, her sweet Robin, and the subject of centuries of speculation about what truly passed between them. Historians have debated whether their bond was platonic, romantic, or scandalous, but what's often overlooked is how Dudley's story didn't stop at Elizabeth's side. Because behind the roses and pageantry of their courtly flirtation stood another court, altogether one filled with young, beautiful men whose lives orbited Dudley like satellites, whose presence sparked diplomatic discomfort, and whose closeness has made modern historians ask, was Robert Dudley hiding a second truth? Dudley was born into ambition. His father, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had been one of the most powerful men in England until his failed attempt to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. That act of treason nearly destroyed the family. Robert was imprisoned in the Tower of London and only narrowly escaped execution. But fortune turned. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, Dudley's star rose with hers. Their bond was immediate and intense. Elizabeth made him master of the horsey title that meant constant access to the Queen's personal chambers. They rode together, hunted together, dined together. Foreign ambassadors noted the unseemly closeness of their relationship. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died under mysterious circumstances, found with a broken neck at the bottom of a staircase, the scandal nearly destroyed him. Marriage was now out of the question. But his place beside Elizabeth remained untouched. And yet, for all the talk of Elizabeth and Dudley, another side of the man rarely makes it into the spotlight. Because while Dudley was fending off whispers about his closeness with the Queen, he was building something else. A private inner court populated almost entirely by men. Not just political allies or military commanders, but painters, musicians, secretaries young, fashionable, often foreign, and they didn't just work for him, they lived with him, traveled with him, received lavish gifts, titles, and patronage far out of proportion to their rank. One name in particular surfaces again and again, Sir Christopher Blount. Blount, a Catholic by birth and nearly 2 decades younger than Dudley, began his career as a relatively obscure gentleman. He rose quickly not just as a soldier, but as a permanent fixture in Dudley's household. Letters between them, though couched in courtly formality, reveal a warmth and familiarity that exceeded typical patronage. Blount accompanied Dudley on campaign. He was granted rooms in the same residence. After Dudley's death, Blount married his widow, Lettice Nolise, a union so awkwardly convenient it raised more questions than it answered. Was it affection, cover, inheritance maneuvering? Even in Dudley's earlier years, foreign ambassadors, particularly from France and Spain, wrote home with thinly veiled jabs at his affections for male courtiers. The Venetian ambassador once referred to Dudley's exceedingly personal manner with his gentlemen, adding that his affections run hot and strangely. These weren't idle court insults. They were diplomatic dispatches, carefully worded, intentionally subtle. Elizabeth herself seemed to tolerate or ignore this side of Dudley. She never punished him for the company he kept. She teased him, elevated him, then punished him politically when he pushed too hard. But she never banished him. Perhaps she knew the truth and didn't care. Or perhaps, like everyone else, she preferred to let the pageantry speak louder than the reality. Robert Dudley died in 1588, just weeks after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, his reputation partially restored and his name forever linked to England's Virgin Queen. But his personal legacy is more complex than the romantic tragedy of unfulfilled love. He was a man of 2 courts, one public, filled with trumpets and banners, and one private, humming with secrets, favors, and unspoken intimacy. And if his love for Elizabeth was real, it was not exclusive. His heart, it seems, had room for more than one form of desire. And with Dudley's carefully managed ambiguity behind us, we turn now to the man who succeeded him in royal intimacy, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. He didn't hide in shadows. He danced in candlelight. And when he whispered to King James, the king whispered back sometimes in language so intimate, even history couldn't pretend not to blush. George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham. He was the man who made a king swoon. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, didn't tiptoe into royal favor, he soared, a comet in a velvet doublet. A man so dazzling, so calculating, so brazen in his ambition that he didn't just dominate the court of King James, he dominated the king himself. Their relationship is one of the most openly intimate male bonds in British royal history, and yet it still lives in the careful language of plausible deniability. But the truth between the lines, beneath the powdered wigs is hard to miss. George Villiers was not just a favorite, he was a lover. Born into a minor noble family, Villiers was handsome, athletic, graceful. He danced, he fenced, he spoke French. And in 1614, at the age of 22, he was introduced to James I. From there, history moved fast. The king was smitten. He called Villiers Steenie, after St. Stephen because his face was like an angel's. He gave him titles at lightning speed: Gentleman of the Bedchamber, then Viscount, then Earl, then Marquis, and finally Duke of Buckingham, all within 7 years. Each promotion faster than the last, each one drawing more ire from jealous nobles who could only watch as the beautiful newcomer became the axis of royal affection. But it wasn't just the speed that raised eyebrows, it was the intimacy. James' eye was never subtle. His letters to Villiers are among the most emotionally naked ever penned by a British monarch. He wrote, "I desire only to live in your love, and to die in it." He called Villiers, "my sweet child and wife." He signed letters, "your father and husband." These weren't just royal flourishes, they were personal declarations, written in a trembling, vulnerable hand. The court buzzed with gossip. Foreign ambassadors reported the relationship with varying degrees of shock and amusement. One French diplomat, writing in code, noted the unseemly favor shown to Villiers and added that the king does not refrain from public displays of affection. Another ambassador called Villiers the most powerful man in England, for he holds the king's heart in his pocket. James did little to deny it. He paraded Villiers through court ceremonies, dressed him in silks, and allowed him to enter his private chambers without notice. When James fell ill, Villiers slept beside him. When Villiers traveled, the king wrote him nearly every day. And when Parliament dared to challenge the Duke's authority, especially during botched military campaigns, James shut them down. But Villiers wasn't just a pretty face with a powerful lover. He was sharp, ambitious, and politically ruthless. He inserted himself into foreign policy, military strategy, and court appointments. He made enemies fast, and they didn't forget. When James died in 1625, Villiers expected to fade into history, but he didn't. Instead, he secured the favor of the new king, Charles I. That relationship was stranger still. Charles and Villiers were close, though not in the same confessional, poetic way. Charles admired Villiers but did not fawn. Still, he trusted him. Villiers arranged Charles's marriage, advised him on war, and retained his position as the most powerful man in the realm. But it wouldn't last. In 1628, at the height of his power, Villiers was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier named John Felton. The killing shocked England. The public reaction was mixed. Some mourned, others celebrated. Felton became an unlikely folk hero. But Charles wept. He locked himself away. The man who had stood so still beside his father had finally been silenced. Villiers' death marked the end of an array, last time a royal favorite held such overwhelming influence, not just behind the throne, but beside it. His legacy is tangled, controversial, but undeniably bold. Was George Villiers gay? By the language of his time, such a question had no framework. But by the language of ours, the answer is written in the ink of his own hand. He loved James. He ruled through James. And he remains, even now, one of the clearest, most undeniable examples of same-sex affection within the English monarchy. And if Villiers was the crown's most brazen romantic, our final subject was its most complicated illusion. Edward VII, known for his parade of mistresses and endless appetites, left behind a legacy of masculine indulgence. But dig into the early letters, the private affections, and you find something stranger. A prince who may have been performing a role he never fully believed. King Edward VII. To the world, he was the playboy king the bulldog in a bow tie, the cigar-puffing, mistress-collecting monarch who turned the throne into a velvet-upholstered chaise lounge. Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, lived under the crushing shadow of propriety for most of his life. But when he finally ascended the throne at age 59, he did so with a reputation for indulgence, charisma, and flamboyant masculinity. He was the monarch of pleasure, known for fine food, French fashion, and a string of lovers that stretched from London to Paris. But, like so many royal performances, Edward's image may have been just that, a carefully curated spectacle, a smokescreen of hyper-heterosexuality that masks something softer, stranger, and more difficult to define. Before he was king, Edward Bertie, to his family, spent most of his life as the Prince of Wales. He was the longest-serving heir apparent in British history at the time, and Queen Victoria made sure he felt every minute of it. She blamed him for the death of his father, Albert, who fell ill shortly after discovering young Bertie had been involved with an actress during a military posting. Victoria never forgave him. She exiled him from politics, withheld trust, and kept him on a short leash. So Bertie found other outlets. The public story is familiar. A prince who indulged in women, wine, and waistcoats. He had a reputation for affairs, many of them with married women from the aristocracy. He fathered illegitimate children, allegedly, frequented Parisian brothels, likely, and cultivated a persona of masculine entitlement so potent it practically wrote itself into Edwardian culture. But the letters he wrote in his early years, especially those penned before his persona was fully calcified, tell a different story. Several of his private correspondences, now tucked away in archives and rarely quoted in full, reveal a young man whose affections were often directed at male friends. These weren't the stiff, courteous letters of political alliance or aristocratic fraternity. They were emotionally rich, sometimes effusive, and occasionally crossed into the language of romantic longing. He praised one young schoolmate's beauty in detail, wrote of missing his presence beside me, of the warmth of being close, of nights too quiet without him. Historians have long argued about how to interpret these letters. Some dismiss them as examples of Victorian sentimentality between men, a style of writing more expressive than modern norms allow. Others point to a pattern, that as Edward aged and was forced into performing a rigid, womanizing role, these kinds of letters stopped. That the emotional openness of his youth was scrubbed away, replaced with the confident smirk of a man who knew how to deflect. Even the flamboyance of his public life invites questions. He was obsessed with appearance just his own, but that of the men around him. He kept a personal valet whose grooming duties included arranging cravats and choosing scents. He admired male dancers, artists, and musicians with a level of detail unusual for a man supposedly devoted to the charms of women. And while he flaunted his female conquests, his closest and longest-lasting relationships, both professional and personal, were with men. One such relationship, with Lord Esher, a courtier and royal advisor, has been noted for its longevity and intensity. Esher kept meticulous diaries filled with flowery praise of Edward. Some entries border on romantic adoration, and while there is no hard evidence of a physical relationship, the emotional tone between them was unmistakably deep and entirely undocumented in official royal accounts. Edward's marriage to Alexandra of Denmark was functional, distant, and for all its public ceremony, emotionally sidelined. Alexandra was graceful and loyal, but Edward preferred his clubs, his cards, and the company of those who asked no questions. By the time he became king, the mask was secure. He ruled with pomp and laughter, with cigars and showmanship, and when he died in 1910, he left behind a nation that remembered his swagger but not his secrets. Edward VII's legacy is, on the surface, one of indulgent heterosexuality. But history is a master of illusion, and Edward was its most charismatic magician. Behind the mistresses and monocles, behind the performative masculinity, there lies the possibility that England's playboy king was, perhaps, playing a role he never entirely chose. And with him, our parade of 30 ends not in scandal or silence, but in ambiguity. Because when it comes to kings and desire, history rarely gives us clarity. It gives us letters, glances, and rumors, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us just enough to read between the lines.